Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Look, it's the end of a long weekend in Victoria, but my goodness, we're a funny lot. We've been whinging about a wet summer, and it's now so hot, it's a climate catastrophe, and we're cancelling everything, including today, the big Moomba parade in Melbourne. But it's a long way off the hottest March weather. That was way back before our emissions obsessions. I'll give you those exact dates in a moment. Here's what else is coming up tonight on Credlin. That Sam Kerr racist allegations not gone away. Today, another one of the left elite tied himself up in knots, trying to explain why you can't be racist to a white person. Now, last week, he had the opposite view. A shocking development today as it looks like the Prime Minister is going to roll over to the pro-Palestinian lobby and resume handing your money over to the now discredited UN body. It's an outrage given UNRWA's links to the atrocities of October 7. In an echo of our voice referendum here, over the weekend, voters in Ireland rejected identity politics in a sign that the Western world is waking up. And I'll speak soon with one Victorian Liberal MP who was brave enough to rebuke her party and her leader, John Pizzuto, by rejecting Labor's latest climate targets.
Decisions that have been made within these four walls have absolutely devastated rural and regional communities, and I mean devastated. There has been no transition. I've spoken to businesses who say the only support that they have received has been advice as to how to close down their businesses.
But first, to be honest, I was a bit reluctant to be drawn into the whole Sam Kerr affair last week because who amongst us hasn't said something in the heat of the moment that we might later regret? And more generally, I'm over this whole offence culture that makes a dumb comment a criminal matter. But now that it's triggered an extraordinary display of leftist double standards that have only got worse and worse, including today, well, that now needs to be called out. Take the former Socceroo, the now head of the Republican movement, Craig Foster. Last week, he said the governing body should consider stripping Kerr of her Matilda's captaincy.
I think the game should definitely consider it. You know, I can't say whether I'd do it right now, but I would certainly consider it. You know, if I was the chair of Football Australia, this is a live issue right now. You know, we're talking about racism, which is really serious. You know, players have repeatedly been stood down, and you have to answer that. You have to answer that question right now.
But after a predictable pile-on where even the Prime Minister was quick to defend Kerr, Foster has now recanted, issuing a grovelling apology to Kerr on X and posting a long statement claiming that no white person can ever be the victim of racism. Those of us who aren't a minority, he says, can't possibly know how it feels to be told that we don't belong or to have faced intergenerational racism. Now, as far as I can see, that's the racism that you've never personally suffered, but the victimhood you still have because your ancestors faced racism. Hence Foster's conclusion that as a white person, and he says, I cannot experience racism in Australia. Well, this morning on Melbourne radio, he kept at it, trying to explain why racism doesn't apply to white or Caucasian people, even if it's their skin colour that's attacked, even if the white person feels racially offended.
But racism is something different, and it's something that we don't understand very well, and that's including me. As you say, I'm even an anti-racism campaigner. The issue of racism, or the concept of racism, is about much more than just our slurs or our attacks using colour, as awful as they are and as offensive as they are. It's about systems and processes that make marginalised groups seem, appear, feel inferior. And that's a very different thing.
So if someone had called out Kerr's part Indian heritage, that would be racist. But when she allegedly called the London policeman a stupid white bastard, well, that can't be racist because of inherent power imbalances. So goes the logic. And at this point about power imbalances based on skin colour alone, the radio host Tom Elliott took up with Foster.
But how is Sam Kerr a marginalised group? She's one of the best-known soccer players in the world. She makes $3 million a year. She happens to have just one of 4 grandparents who was Indian. In what way is she marginalised?
Yes, I'm saying that Sam is marginalised. What I'm talking about is she's been, I think, rightly condemned for the disrespectful and offensive comments she made to a white police officer. But the white police officer is not a part of a marginalised community.
And it kept going on.
So absolutely clear, it is impossible, in your view, to be racist against a white person.
Because racism is not just an interpersonal attack based on our colour. Racism is something that makes us feel inferior, and racism is perpetrated against marginalised groups. I'm not marginalised. You're not marginalised. It's a different thing.
Now, please forgive my language, but calling someone a stupid white bastard, in that context, white is hardly being used as a term of endearment. So what have we got here? Well, on the alleged facts, Kerr's behaved badly. Although, as I said earlier, I don't think people should be before the courts on a criminal charge for a bit of intemperate language. But this is now much more than that, and it's the hypocrisy we can't let slide. Craig Foster and all the others who've denied that anti-white racism is even possible have made complete charlatans of themselves. And the modern idiocy of twisting ourselves into not-sober identity politics has yet again been highlighted. Now imagine this scenario playing out, not in London, but in Australia, if the Voice had got up. 2 sets of rules in this country depending on whether you're an Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal Australian. Again, we've got to thank God for common sense in the Australian voter, for rejecting the Voice as they did. But stay on guard, Australia, because I promise you, this racism double standard's not gone away. And it's incumbent on all of us to reject any renewed push to divide us by our ethnicity. And look, today, this has really got under my skin. All this weather porn here in Melbourne. Today we learned the Melbourne City Council, of course, cancelling that Moomba parade because of, quote, extreme conditions, namely a temperature that they expected to hit 38 degrees. I don't think it even got there. Now, since when has 38 degrees triggered, quote, a severe heatwave alert? And since when has it been enough to cancel an outdoor parade? Now, basically, this is a leftist council trying to reinforce notions of climate catastrophe, even though 38 degrees is nothing compared to what Melburnians have endured in the past, back then without air conditioning, often without even a fan. Melbourne's hottest March day ever was 41.7 degrees back in 1940. Our hottest January day was 45.6 degrees in 1939. And our hottest ever day was back February 2009, Black Saturday, 46.9 degrees then. So my conclusion from all of this, less that Melbourne's getting hot, more that the City Council's going soft and woke. And we'll talk about hot and dry. I want to give a shout out to the wonderful community of Witchy Proof, where I was on the weekend. In town, of course, to support a dear friend, former Richmond AFL great Merv Cain, who was launching his latest book, this one about a remarkable Tiwi Islander footballer. Now, if you think it was hot in Melbourne or wherever you were, let me tell you, it was hotter than Hades in Victoria's Mallee. But I'm a local girl, born and bred. That heat was bearable. I must admit my tolerance to the flies of the Mallee seemed to have deserted me on the weekend. One thing that struck me as I drove along the Calder and later talking to the locals up there was some of the issues in their area. And one of the big ones was their growing opposition to the giant transmission towers planned to run across hundreds of kilometres of private farmland. I stopped by the road and got you some of the signs. Protests there, everywhere. If the government thinks the fight's over, they are kidding themselves. Locals said to me they've only just got started. A shout out too to witchy living legend, Mr. Mick Giddings. Here we are on Saturday. I got the honour of signing this very special Witchy Proof t-shirt that's hung in the local museum. Now, Mick's one of those rare individuals you find in country towns across this country who do more for others than they ever do for themselves. Over many years, he's amassed a huge collection of artefacts and stories about the settlement of the local area, stories that involve my dad and his family going back some 6 generations, many other families too. Now, sadly, my generation looks like it's the end of the line of the Credlins born in Witchy-proof, but I tell you what, my heart's still there. My late dad always said to me, never forget where you come from. And I promise you, Witchy-proof, I never have. So if you're driving up the Calder, stop in please at Mick's Museum in Witchy-proof. Tell him Peter Credlin sent you along and he'll tell you stories of the extraordinary resilience of the men and women that built everything we have today. I did wonder as I drove home with my air-conditioned car what they would make of our crazy world today and the snowflake generation in particular, but we'll leave that for another day. All right, let's get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Treasurer Jim Chalmers is talking up the potential of price reductions on everyday items as he slashes hundreds of tariffs.
Nuisance tariffs strangle productivity and weigh business down in red tape with very little return, and that's why we are eliminating almost 500 of them.
From July 1, hundreds of import taxes on the books, which barely raise any money, will be axed. From toasters, tools and toothbrushes to dishwashers and sleeping bags.
It will provide a bit of extra help with the cost of living challenge by making everyday items just that little bit cheaper.
On the Treasurer's own numbers, if you believe them, this is $1 per Australian per year. That won't make any substantial difference.
Seriously, mate, they better come up with better offers than this rubbish.
Most of the goods listed are exempt from tariffs anyway because they come from countries covered by free trade deals.
I think the Treasurer's rhetoric is a bit overblown here. These tariff reductions are going to affect almost no products in our economy.
Meanwhile, the Treasurer's plan to raise taxes on the big oil and gas giants remains stalled in the Senate, despite this fresh olive branch.
Our changes are designed to be better for the environment, better for business and better for our economy.
The Greens want the petroleum resource rent tax changes to be tougher. The Coalition is demanding green tape relief for resource projects. Now, Jim Chalmers says approval processes will be streamlined.
Some of the changes to environmental approval processes that they are seeking to negotiate are already happening for their own good reasons and not as a bargaining chip in the Senate.
Face value, it looks to be more consultation and no delivery, but we'll work through it in the coming days and weeks.
It was an early start for the Prime Minister this morning on the shores of Lake Burley Griffin in Canberra for the Balloon Spectacular. It was then south to Tasmania, where he launched Labor's state campaign 12 days out from the election.
Tasmanians want to change the government. There is only one way to do it, and that's by voting Labor and voting for Rebecca White.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's get into all those headlines and more. As always on a Monday, National Editor for The Australian, Dennis Shanahan. Well, thank you as always, Dennis. This latest freshwater poll in the Australian Financial Review today says the PM's rebounding as the preferred Prime Minister, up 5 points since last month. They'll be happy about that, sure, but the primary vote shows the coalition still well ahead. Now, if you factor in Dunkley and I think those private health insurance hikes last week, more power bill pain expected in the coming days, I still think these are pretty tricky times for the PM, Dennis. And I know they've got the budget. I know they're banking a lot on the budget. But if you go too hard on handouts, you risk inflation spiking all over again, don't you?
Yes, well, I think Labor would be pleased with this result. And Freshwater's often picked a trend. It's one of the earlier polls. And I think what it's showing is that Anthony Albanese's personal support is recovering. Now, this is very important, and this has taken 3 months, more than 3 months. And this started in December. Anthony Albanese realised he was in trouble. His personal support was going down ahead of the party support. And now, after 3 months and $105 billion in tax giveaways, he is actually starting to get back some of that personal support. The government will be happy, but, and it's a big but, their primary vote is still below, in this poll, what it was at at the last election, which means it would have a minority government at best. There has to be more improvement on the party vote. The Prime Minister's vote has improved. It still has to improve a lot. And the Coalition's primary vote, up just 1 point, but just enough. It's 1 point now of having a 4 in front of it for a primary vote. Now, it needs more than that, as it did in Dunkley in the by-election, but I think that the government will be happy with the way things are going, but there's a lot more to be done, and there's still more ground for the Coalition to make up.
And let's not forget, at the last election too, 7 out of 10 voters did not vote for the Prime Minister. I mean, it was a heavy vote against Scott Morrison, but Labor's primary was exceptionally low. Let's go to these revelations today about Stephen Jones, because if you thought Tony Burke was bad last week, when we found out he spent $57,000 for 4 days in the US, the Assistant Treasurer, Stephen Jones, $43,000 over 8 months for Comcars. Now, that might sound reasonable. You think that's the only way he's got to get around. Well, no, he gets on planes and charges the taxpayer. He's got a taxpayer-funded car, or certainly a vehicle covered by taxpayers to drive around in. But on top of that, he gets himself a hire car to take him between his electorate in Shell Harbour and Parliament House. When pushed on this, he won't even explain why he's doing this. Now, honestly, I am tough on this stuff, Dennis, as you know. The bloke should drive himself down there, or he flies and commutes some other way, or gets on a train maybe. But I mean, who in the government, Special Minister of State maybe, Prime Minister's office maybe, who is watching this stuff? Because these MPs, they are literally taking the proverbial from the taxpayer with this stuff, because it's not an isolated case. It's a real pattern now.
These are the things that really annoy voters, particularly during tough times. A failure to explain why you're doing something makes it worse. And the question is, why is the Prime Minister's office or the Finance Minister not leaning on this and saying to everyone, make sure you can justify what you are doing on these travel? All this travel comes out. It's not secret, and it comes out. And the sort of thing, like when Bronwyn Bishop got a helicopter to a golf course, finished her off as Speaker of the House.
Yeah.
Yes, well, one trip. So these are the things that annoy people enormously, and the government has to be careful, because no doubt there'll be more like this come out, and they are going to have to be able to say, we are doing something, at least making people explain why they're spending the money they are.
I referenced Sam Kerr and this whole brouhaha from last week that's now still running into this week, and this idea that you can't be racist to a white person. And I guess the reinforcement this has, that everyone voted the right way they did in the referendum, that we made the right call, that if we'd entrenched racial differences in our constitution, this sentiment, which I think is absolutely wrong, that you can't be racist to a white person, that would be sort of par for the course. This is troubling, that we're 10 days on from this information coming out of London, Dennis, and we've got this sort of commentary from senior people in the community, including senior politicians.
Yes, look, apart from the fact that we actually have a case running, so it's best not to comment on it, but by the other side of the coin, Sam Kerr has admitted making various comments, some of them, including the fact that she referred to white. Now, I think that if you refer to anyone's race or creed or culture in a disparaging way, or part of a disparaging comment, then that can be considered to be insulting, offensive and racist. But of course, the point here is that she has allegedly breached a British law. It's about what the law is in England about race hate. Now, you may not like it, you might think it's silly, all the rest, but this is what has happened. And to be trying back here in Australia to renegotiate what's racist and what's not is pointless. And I think that it just goes to show the extent to which people will try and go to make excuses for offensive behaviour. I mean, let's just get over it and take a bit of offence from time to time.
Right, let's go to Ireland because they have rejected virtue signalling in two massive referendum proposals over the weekend. The first was to alter the wording of the Constitution to include families that are not based on marriage. Well, that went down 67.7%. And the second, and this one's huge, this was to change the wording around the role of women in the home. That was rejected by the Irish voter by a massive 73.9%. Now, a bit like the voice here, Dennis, it was David and Goliath. A lot of money with the government side pushing the yes vote. Ordinary Irish punters on the no side. Not a lot of information given out by the government. You know, basically, you should vote for this. It's the right thing to do. So the Irish rejected identity politics like we did here, which makes me hopeful maybe that the West is waking up.
Well, in this particular instance, it was a massive case of virtue signalling. They even rushed the poll so that they could, the preparations for the poll, so they could hold it on International Women's Day, so they could get rid of old-fashioned language out of the Constitution. Good grief, if you tried to get old-fashioned language out of every constitution around the world, imagine if the Americans tried to take out references of old-fashioned language. It was absurd. Although all of the politicians were in agreement, although lesser than others, some were, not as enthusiastic as others, it was a complete failure of the elite, of the political classes, the bureaucracy and the financial elite trying to tell people what they should do about their own traditional views. And I think this was one really for the common Irish people just to say, we are not going to change our constitution on a whim, just as the Australian did the same.
And of course, the Irish had voted for same-sex marriage long before the Australian community had.
Indeed. But again, this is a question of when you come down to trying to change the referendum, when you try to change the Constitution, the public takes it very seriously. It is entirely a different issue, and it's also a different issue about trying to say, well, with same-sex marriage, we're trying to give people similar rights. But with these referendum, they were trying to give people different rights. And that's where it comes down to popular exclusion.
Spot on, Dennis Shanahan. See you next week. All right, after the break, despite a review still pending, the Albanese government looks likely to reinstate funding for UNRWA. This is the UN agency that is facing allegations of Hamas terror links hanging over its head out of October 7. Plus, I'll speak with one Victorian Liberal MP who's got enough of a spine to say no to the insane 95% renewables target that even her own party and opposition leader supported. Welcome back. Still to come, the lone Victorian Liberal, well, will include Moira Deeming, so she's one of two, who's been bold enough to rebuke her own party not supporting these unrealistic energy targets in a state, of course, plagued by power blackouts. But first, troubling news tonight with the Albanese government likely to resume funding UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency that has projects in Palestine areas of Gaza and the West Bank. UNRWA is, of course, the same group that had their funding frozen by Australia and 16 other nations after serious allegations emerged that some UNRWA staff had participated in the October 7 terror attacks on Israel. At this stage, Penny Wong's office is yet to confirm that the funding will resume, but off-the-record sources are saying that moves are being made behind the scenes that will make Australia follow the lead of Canada and Sweden in reinstating UNRWA funding. Now, no doubt this will appeal to many within Labor who never agreed with the freeze in the first place, but this is bad news for those who know the troubled history of UNRWA that began long before October 7. For more on this, I'm joined now by the President of the Australian Jewish Association, David Adler. Well, we know that Canada, David, and Sweden are resuming funding. Is this putting pressure on Labor, or is this happening internally inside Labor factions who we know, many of them, did not support the freeze in the first place?
Peter, I'm absolutely certain that Labor wants to put more money into UNRWA. It's sort of something close to their hearts, And the evidence of this is that shortly after the Labor government was elected, one of the first actions of Foreign Minister Penny Wong was to double the funding to UNRWA. She's further increased it significantly since the 7th of October. But herein is a really interesting issue for the coalition to use for the next election, because regardless of one's knowledge or interest in Middle East politics, and I accept that most Aussies would not have a lot of interest in it, they do not want our money going anywhere near terrorism. They don't want us involved in the training or funding of murderers, kidnappers, rapists, jihadists, etc. And UNRWA and Hamas have been shown to be closely integrated, and if you give money to UNRWA, it is very close to giving money to Hamas.
Well, I agree with that, and that's certainly the view of US intelligence agency about the links between UNRWA staff and the October 7 atrocities. But there's also a formal investigation into all of the links between UNRWA and Hamas more broadly. Now, surely we've got to wait for this investigation and the reporting to happen before we could put another dollar into this body.
Well, we've got to be very cautious about UNRWA investigating itself. Within the last week, Israel has identified another 450 UNRWA employees who are terrorists. They've shared that information with the United States and the United Nations. There is the physical evidence of Hamas using UNRWA facilities for all sorts of purposes. And it's a great shame that Penny Wong, when she visited Israel, did not actually go down to the south to see the physical evidence. Maybe if she was better informed, she wouldn't be in such a hurry to turn on the money tap back to UNRWA.
Look, there's intelligence things I know in my former life working inside government that I can't share publicly, but let's say the proof's in the pudding. The coalition government pulled back money to UNRWA and Labor has very rapidly increased that money to UNRWA. Trust me, there's a lot there behind the organisation. Let's go to those disturbing scenes yet again that emerged over the weekend. This anti-Semitism, again in a Sydney mosque, this time in Western Sydney. It was filmed a little way back in February, but it's horrific. The Imam described Jews as a criminal, barbaric, tyrannical enemy and demanded Palestine be restored through jihad. Have a listen.
وعادت الشعوب مرة أخرى تناكف اليهود وتتكلم عن صهيونيتهم وعدائهم وقتلهم وعدم رحمتهم للخلق وأنهم عدو مجرم متوحش صائل ظالم تعدى على أرض الناس وبغى عليهم.
David, we're tying ourselves in knots about what Sam Kerr said to a white police officer in London, yet we're watching this play out in a mosque in Sydney, horrific talk of jihad. How on earth is this allowed?
Well, it shouldn't be allowed, and it's certainly not Australian. And it incites hatred and violence. I can't tell you the number of threats that the Jewish community has received over the last few months. I've personally received threats, including death threat, and the community broadly has had to increase security. I had a meeting with counter-terrorism police, and we had a really interesting discussion, and one of the questions I asked was, we know where most of these threats are coming from, and unfortunately they're coming from the more radical end of the Islamic community in Australia. Has there been any threats arising out of the Jewish community towards the Islamic community? And their answer was zero. This is a one-way street. This is a serious problem. We need much, much better leadership and strength from government. France, where this has got further out of hand, is now closing down some of the more radical mosques and expelling some of the more radical imams. I have little doubt that Australia will come to that point if it doesn't rein it in and take action very, very soon. This is ridiculous, and I don't think the majority of Australians would want that sort of racial vilification occurring in our country.
No, we don't, David. We should be shutting them down and deporting them here in Australia too, as you're right to point out they are doing in France. Thank you for your time, David Adler there from the Jewish Association President. All right, let's go to the Victorian Liberal Party because we might have some common sense starting to emerge. One MP recently was brave enough to break ranks and stand against new legislation for absurd renewable energy targets, including increasing Victoria's target from 50% renewables by 2035 to 95%. Now, sadly, with the acquiescence of the Liberal opposition, the legislation passed anyway, but not without causing further friction within the Liberal party room. Shadow Ministers Brad Batten and Richard Riordan both formally opposed the bill, in yet another sign the opposition leader John Pizzuto does not lead a united party. Joining me now to discuss this, the MP brave enough to say no in the Victorian Parliament, Renee Heath. Well, I wanted to talk to you tonight, Renee, because I read your remarks, incredibly passionate speech. You're absolutely for the environment, but you care about jobs. You want gas on the table. You want Victoria to make things and have a decent, solid budget and get rid of some of this debt. Give us an understanding about why you took the stand you did. What are your reasons?
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. There were two main reasons, really. The first one is I represent the Eastern Victoria region, which is an area that has been completely obliterated by Labor's green policies. And our area, particularly the Latrobe Valley, is still trying to recover from the closure of the Hazelwood Power Station, which saw the loss of 1,000 jobs. And plus, we had a promise that we would transition to renewables. Well, almost 15 years on, and we still haven't seen any of that. And then, as you would know, at the beginning of this year, we saw the closure of the native timber industry. That has absolutely devastated so many communities like Hayfield and Orbost. Again, thousands of jobs have been lost, and there has been promise to transition. Well, so far, the only transition we've received there is consultants coming in and saying how to close down your business. So then late last year, I went to a rally in Traralgon, and there were these signs there, and it said, first the energy industry, then the native timber industry, what's next? Our farmers. And I've spoken to a lot of people, and I'm concerned that this legislation will be that attack on farmers.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a lot of reasons around that. Firstly, I think people are concerned that prime agricultural land will be cut up with solar panels and with wind turbines. But also I'm concerned that farmers and individuals will lose their property rights because of transmission lines going through their area. So there's a whole lot of reasons, and those are the main... and then the second one is I think that this legislation is completely unachievable. So in order to get to the 82%, which we set nationally, we would have to install about 22,000 solar panels per day, and also 40 wind turbines per month. Now, Victoria has just gone over and above that to 95%, yet I have looked and I've looked and looked, and my staff have looked, and a lot of people have. We cannot find any detail of what the approach, achievable steps are that we need to take to get to that. So I'm worried that we're misleading the public and that it's not achievable at all.
So you're not wrong about the degradation of farmland, the risk to agricultural land, and how angry regional communities are. I was on the other side of Victoria, so on the western side in the Mallee on the weekend, and all the way along the Calder are these signs on farmers' fences saying stop the transmission lines, lack of consultation. There was one that says say no to AEMO that's in charge of the rollout. They don't feel consulted. They say this will put, as I said, agricultural land at risk. And they think these targets are utterly meaningless, and then they'll come after, cattle and sheep and, the meat we've got on our plate. If people are saying that and your colleagues are saying this to me behind closed doors, How is it you are the only Liberal brave enough to talk this sort of common sense in the Parliament?
Well, I think, again, there's probably two reasons for that too. Number one is not everybody comes from an area that has been reliant on coal and that is currently reliant on...
But they're all reliant on coal-fired power in Victoria, Renee.
Well, we are, and we all rely on farmers as well, which brings me to the second point, which is that I think that there is an awful lot of intimidation by activists on lawmakers, and there is an awful lot that people know that if they stand up to something like this, they are going to get shouted down, they are going to get campaigned against. And I think that there is that little bit of fear. But what I think is good that has come out of this is that I have been able to mount a pretty good argument of common sense and facts. And I think it's not until we have the ability to do that that you are able to show fact versus fiction. And I think as time goes on, and we've seen this in many other countries, for instance, some of the forerunners for renewables were areas like Italy, Germany, the Netherlands and Austria.
And they've all wound it back.
And they're all winding
But we know
back.
that now. What I don't understand and what my viewers don't understand is you're a Liberal, you're saying everything that stacks up based on fact, science and basic engineering. Where is the rest of the Liberal Party? Why is John Pizzuto going down and agreeing with Labor on 95% renewables when we all know it can't be achieved, and we also know the Liberal Party voters and supporters don't back this Labor push? Why is this happening? And what's this going to do to his leadership, Renee?
Well, I think in terms of that last question, the way I've seen it, and I've seen some interesting media coverage about what it might mean, this was never against a person. Politics is the contest of ideas, and it shouldn't be the contest of personalities. Unfortunately, it has gone this way. When I voted to oppose this particular legislation, it was the idea that I was voting against. There wasn't anything in me that was voting against John. I support his leadership. I haven't had the opportunity to have a conversation as to why he didn't support this other than, you know, in the party room. But I think there's a huge difference between particularly a seat like Hawthorn, where this wouldn't be their main voting intention. You know,
I know, but I'll be tough here. If you are the leader of the party, you lead for the entire state, and you've got to lead in those seats that will make or break government. His problem is he sees everything through the prism of Hawthorn, and that's not Victoria. It's not the Victorian economy. It doesn't drive Victorian jobs in the way that your area in Latrobe Valley does. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. You've done.
You've got a spine. There you go, Renee Heath. Wouldn't we like more Liberals like that? All right, after the break, power bill set to increase again. The regulator set for a big announcement in coming days. I'll get you some predictions on what this will mean for you. Plus, the pressures on Chris Bowen. Signs the government might have to roll over on the issue of car emissions. And that storm in the UK over the Mother's Day photo of the Princess of Wales, Kate, and the royal children. Welcome back. Still to come, social media giant Meta. Its stranglehold over your news. Why it's so bad for conservative voices in a moment. But first, let's bring in my panel. LNP MP Keith Pitt, former Howard Government Minister Gary Hargrave. Gentlemen, welcome. Keith, this draft default market offer, we've been expecting it and expecting it. Of course, it was never going to come out before Dunkley. It's now expected in coming days. There's plenty of predictions. It'll skyrocket our power prices. Help us all understand what it means.
Well, Peter, I went back and had a look. When the coalition government implemented the default market offer with Angus Taylor as Energy Minister, that resulted in a 10% drop in electricity prices for households. So it went down 10%. But what we've seen in recent months and recent years under the Labor government is ever increasing costs of electricity. You now have the absurd situation where you've got areas of the country where the wholesale price is negative or zero. They're being propped up by subsidies through the renewable energy certificates, for example, whether it's the small-scale system or large-scale system. And, of course, those with the domestic rooftop solar are getting paid for whatever it is they're generating into the grid, whether that's 5 cents, 8 cents, 20 cents or 44 cents. And, of course, those who are only operational of a night time where none of this stuff works, well, they're getting in the neck too. So I'll guarantee you one thing, it's going up. and the power price will continue to go up under this Labor government.
Yeah, Gary, what about this storm that's erupted this afternoon about a photo put up for Mother's Day, UK Mother's Day is a little bit earlier, by Princess Kate and the children? A whole lot of photo agencies have said there's a kill notice now on this image. Don't use it. It's been manipulated. It's a fake, blah, blah, blah. It was all meant to, hose down conspiracy theories about her recovery from surgery, but it seems to have fired them up, doesn't it?
Oh, look, yeah, they're just looking for conspiracies, of course. But look, Her late Majesty always used to say, I need to be seen to be believed. And I think Queen Elizabeth II, may God have mercy on her soul, would be shaking her head. Look, technology exists, Peter. Anybody can take a photo of anything. There are some phone companies that are now saying you can buy our phone and you can take multiple pictures and we'll stitch together the best version of that picture to make it look like a brilliant picture. And we're now bringing back Marilyn Monroe as an artificially intelligent generated image. I mean, everywhere you turn, you've got this stuff going on. And so people who are using this technology day in, day out on causes that suit them are now seemingly arcing up on the matter of the Princess of Wales. Look, whether the photo is photoshopped, real, painted on, whatever it might happen to be, I thought it was a lovely photo. The kids look happy. She looked happy. I think it was a proper reassurance sort of moment, and good on them for doing it.
I think it was the Queen Mum too who used to say, never complain, never explain. That might be another one as well. Hey, exactly. Keith, talk to me about Chris Bowen and this thought today that he's got so much pressure from industry, plenty of pressure from the opposition too, about these very controversial vehicle emission standards, that it's going to skyrocket the cost of utes and pickup trucks and SUVs in Australia, that he's considering backing down. I mean, I think it's a massive own goal, but do you think he will back down?
Peter, if we're counting own goals by Chris Bowen, he's in triple figures. It's got to be 100 plus to none. He is the greatest frontbencher for the coalition that I know of. And he's got a PB, no doubt about it. But look, I think he'll go out and play the game. He'll continue, shaking hands and doing what he thinks right with the Motor Traders Association, for example. But he won't make any changes. They are committed to this. And the worst part of all of it is when you change models or you have a big impact change like this, it takes a lot of planning. You need literally years' worth of parts, and you need training, and you need all the things that get rolled out across all the dealerships across the country. It costs an absolute fortune, and you actually need to have some structure and time in front of it to be successful. Now, there's none of that. We know it's going to push up the price of the most popular cars in Australia, and guess who's going to pay for it? All of your viewers, particularly the ones in regional Australia, because there is nothing else out of this other than higher costs. And I saw stories on other media outlets last night, Peter, talking this up about how they're going to save a fortune in power, I've got that wrong, I'm stuck on electricity, on fuel prices. It's just not going to happen. We can't produce it in Australia. Chris Bowen won't roll over. He'll just deliver what he said he would.
Yeah.
Gary, what did you think of Moomba being cancelled today in Melbourne? The parade's gone because we're in this cataclysmic, catastrophic climate weather. I don't think we got to 38. It was probably about 36 in Melbourne. A lot hotter in my day growing up in the Mallee. But, I mean, we've gone soft, haven't we?
And also we're looking for catastrophes, every time. I've seen a lot of young journos, and there's some great people who work here at Sky and other places that I've worked, and I've just said, don't call it unprecedented. Just because you've never seen it before doesn't mean it hasn't happened before. Brisbane's just had this really wet summer after predicting a dry summer. Well, guess what? The summer we've had in Brisbane, for instance, is exactly the same summer we had 50 years ago when I was a kid growing up here. You could almost set your watch by it. So Melbourne's always had hot weather, and it always lingers into autumn. And, of course, come Easter, it'll go cold, and then it'll probably snow, and there'll be another catastrophe. I think people have gone soft. Get out there and enjoy Moomba. Yeah, that's right. That's one afternoon, and then the football starts. It's going to be bad weather somewhere along the way. It's hot, it's dry, it's wet. We've had all of that in Brisbane today. It's been very Melbourne, actually.
I can't even chip you for that comment about 4 seasons in one day, because if you live in Melbourne, it's absolutely on the money. Gents, I'll see you both next week. Thank you, as always. It is true. It's crazy weather in Melbourne. All right, after the break, I'm going to give you a sneak peek of the upcoming doco on the tech giant Meta and why you should be concerned if you like a centre-right view of the world. It is dangerous for democracy. Welcome back. Social media giant Meta is facing pushback over its shock decision to stop paying Australian news outlets for their content, not to mention its ongoing suppression of free speech that was so prevalent during the Voice debate. An upcoming exclusive documentary by Sky News investigative reporter Jonathan Lee called Tech Tyrants, Facebook's War in Australia, delves into the immense power Meta wields in the online space.
Well, if you look at Meta, they're a central player in one of the biggest issues currently facing all societies, that being online harm. Whether it be through misinformation or disinformation, fake news. Whether it be through cyberbullying that occurs on their platform. Whether it be through the online scams, which are increasingly impacting the back pockets of all people, and particularly happening here in Australia.
Joining me now live from outside Meta's headquarters in Australia, Sky News reporter there, Jonathan Lee. Well, Jono, explain to my viewers that this is not just a blue between two big corporate entities. This is about the integrity of Australian news, isn't it? Explain why it's so important.
Well, be nervous, be angry, and for very good reason. For more than a decade now, what Facebook did was they took the media content which was uploaded to the website, or uploaded to its platform, and they monetised it. They used it for clicks. They used it to build their own empire. Back in 2021, the hard work of the last coalition government and the rest of Parliament agreed that there needed to, in effect, be a media bargaining code. Meta and Google were forced to negotiate and pay a decent price. If they weren't, they were going to be dragged under that code and made to come up with something. Now, eventually, they coughed up tens of millions of dollars, which is currently being used to provide legitimate news content on the social media platforms. Now, the better part of 2 weeks ago, Meta sent out an email to the news bosses, and we're not just talking News Corp, we're talking 7, 9, ABC, and they summoned them individually to one-on-one meetings. It was 9 a.m. for our boss, Michael Miller, and he was told in a 9-minute meeting Meta, Facebook, wouldn't pay another cent for that Australian media content which it uses. Now, what appears to be happening here is they're being told, or we're being told, that if we force them to go back to the negotiating table, they will in effect just stop all news on their platform. And what happens then is you get unregulated content. You get people with their own channels, their own discussions, their own radical viewpoints. It creates a vortex which isn't what democracy needs, and it doesn't provide for quality journalism and quality jobs. So there is a very serious battle right now happening between Facebook and Meta, its parent company, and the news companies all over Australia who are trying to provide that content. Pete?
I guess what I want my audience to understand, going back to the Voice campaign, I think that is the most salient recent example, is that Meta then tried to silence people like me, people on the no side of the case. Now, unless the government was funding a no case, which they refused today to do, Australians wouldn't have had the information about the alternative view to the government-sponsored yes case. So if you shut down one side of the argument, or in this case, you shut down a centre-right or conservative view, I think that's very dangerous for democracy. I guess that, Jonathan Lee, is my biggest concern, the lack of freedom of expression, or the risk it has over our free expression in Australia.
Yeah, the algorithms which in effect guard the public square is what you're talking about. Now, a couple of things here. Facebook, or Meta, as it's made very clear, is that A, it doesn't care about quality journalism. B, we don't know how that algorithm works. Now, what does it promote? What does it silence? And there are other concerns here too in regards to not just what fills this space, but if you've got a company saying that it's going to reject the laws of a nation, what does that mean for our own sovereignty? How does that end up with those news contents, or those slabs of news which people would normally watch, being filled by malevolent actors who put things up on Facebook for people to watch? It ends up dividing us further. It is huge for our society. It's huge for our discourse, and it's just the sort of thing which 20 years ago you couldn't have imagined.
I'm almost out of time. I want to play something though, because you know I care about regional communities a hell of a lot. Have a listen to this point about regional media.
News services will no doubt be reduced. I mean, it's just a matter of economics, that when you don't have the type of revenue coming in the door, that you've got to look at costs, and one of those costs will be journalism resources, unfortunately. And sadly, there will be newspapers which close. There's no doubt about that.
All right, I'll leave it there with you, Jono, but I mean, that is incredibly important to those across Australia, outside of capital cities. It will impact their news hugely. Thank you for your time. All the best for the documentary. You can watch it here, please, Wednesday night on Sky News at 8:30 p.m. Tech Tyrants, Facebook's War on Australia. I implore you, if you care about journalism, I want you to watch it. That's it for me. See you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.